Welcome to Case Files, the show that declassifies the most riveting stories of espionage and high-stakes intelligence. I'm your host, Alex. With me is our lead storyteller, Ben.
Good to be here, Alex.
Ben, today we're diving into the heart of the Cold War, into one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. This isn't just about a spy. It's about a man who was considered a crown jewel by the CIA, a high-ranking Soviet officer who, for over 2 decades, was one of their most valuable assets.
That's right. His name was Dmitri Polyakov. But our story doesn't begin with him. It begins with his downfall and the wave of panic it sent through the CIA. In July 1986, on his 65th birthday, Polyakov was arrested by his own KGB colleagues, many of whom were his former students. He was tried and executed within days.
A swift and brutal end. But for the CIA, the real shock wasn't his death, but the question of how he was caught.
Exactly. He was retired, and they hadn't had contact with him for years. His exposure was a mystery, and it was just the tip of the iceberg. In the year leading up to Polyakov's arrest, the CIA's network inside the Soviet Union was collapsing at an alarming rate.
What was happening?
One after another, their top-level Soviet sources were being exposed and arrested. In May 1985, a KGB officer at the Soviet embassy in Athens gets a call to return to Moscow for a family emergency. Sensing a trap, he calls his CIA handler and defects to the US just in time. 2 months later, another KGB officer, this one in Nigeria, isn't so lucky. He returns to Moscow for a vacation and is arrested right at the airport. A month after that, the same thing happens to a third officer in Lisbon.
Some of their assets are being rolled up systematically.
And it wasn't just their Soviet agents. In early 1986, a CIA officer working under diplomatic cover at the US Embassy in Moscow goes to meet a source and walks right into a KGB ambush. He and his source are both arrested. The CIA was losing its eyes and ears inside the Soviet Union at an unprecedented rate. Over 35 high-level assets in just a few months.
This couldn't be a coincidence. They had to have a mole.
A major one. The agency was in crisis. They formed an elite 5-person task force to hunt for the traitor. The operation was codenamed Mole Hunt. And their investigation would eventually lead them to one of their own, a man who would be classified as one of the most dangerous American spies of the century, Aldrich Ames.
Aldrich Ames. His name is infamous in the history of espionage. Tell us about him. How does a man become a CIA officer and then betray his country so completely?
Ames's story is a fascinating one. His own father was a CIA officer. Ames himself joined the agency in the 1960s after a brief flirtation with acting. He was initially described in his psych reports as mature, motivated, and intelligent. He married a fellow trainee, Nancy, who gave up her own intelligence career to support his.
So he was a legacy, a company man from the start.
He was. His first overseas posting was in Ankara, Turkey, where his job was to recruit Soviet agents. He was successful, but his performance review was surprisingly negative. His superior called him unsuccessful and recommended he was unsuitable for any further overseas work.
That must have been a huge blow to his ego.
It was, and it seemed to fester. But he was brought back to the States and put in the Soviet Eastern Europe division, where he excelled. He mastered Russian and became an expert on the KGB. He was rising through the ranks, but he also developed a serious drinking problem and a habit of having affairs.
The classic signs of a man unraveling.
Very much so. His first marriage fell apart. His career was marked by moments of extreme carelessness, like the time he left a briefcase full of classified documents on the New York subway after a drunken lunch with a Soviet asset. Incredibly, he only received a verbal reprimand for that.
It sounds like the agency was very forgiving.
Perhaps too forgiving. In 1981, he was posted to Mexico City. His performance there was abysmal. He recruited 0 new agents in 2 years. Instead, he spent his time drinking and began an affair with a Colombian embassy employee named Maria del Rosario. He fell completely in love with her, spending lavishly and going deep into debt to maintain their lifestyle. So he has a drinking problem, a history of recklessness, and now he's in serious financial trouble. This is a perfect storm for betrayal.
The perfect storm. He divorces his first wife, which comes with a hefty financial settlement. He marries Rosario, whose expensive tastes only plunge him further into debt. He's desperate for money. At the same time, his job gives him access to the CIA's most sensitive files, the names of every single Soviet agent working for the United States. And he decides to sell them.
In April 1985, he makes his move. He walks into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and hands over an envelope. To prove he's the real deal, he writes the code name of a KGB officer working inside the embassy on the outside of the envelope, a name only a handful of people should know.
What was in the envelope?
The names of 2 high-level Soviet spies working for the CIA, and a demand for $50,000. To cover his tracks, he simultaneously files a report with the CIA claiming he is trying to recruit that same KGB officer, justifying his visit to the embassy. It was a brilliant piece of tradecraft.
And the Soviets took the bait.
They did. A month later, they paid him the $50,000. And with that, the floodgates opened. Ames began selling out every asset he could, delivering devastating blows to U.S. intelligence. He would eventually be paid over $2 million by the Soviets, making him one of the highest-paid spies in history.
And back at the CIA, the mole hunt was going nowhere.
They were stumped. They had a list of 169 officers who had access to the compromised files. The task of investigating all of them was overwhelming. It was then that a female investigator on the team, Sandy Grimes, had an idea. She suggested that each of the 5 members of the task force use their intuition and write down the names of their top 10 suspects.
They were relying on gut feelings at this point.
They had to. And when they compared their lists, one name appeared on all 5, Aldrich Ames.
So they finally had their man.
They had their prime suspect. They put him under intense surveillance. They noticed his lavish spending, the new Jaguar, the $500,000 house paid for in cash, the massive phone and credit card bills. His cover story was that his wife's family in Colombia was wealthy. So Sandy Grimes personally flew to Colombia to investigate.
And what did she find?
She found that his wife's family was of very modest means. They weren't poor, but they certainly weren't funding a life of luxury. In fact, their financial situation had only improved after their daughter married Ames. He had been sending them money. It was the final lie that sealed his fate.
So they had him.
On February 21, 1994, Aldrich Ames and his wife were arrested. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His wife received a 5-year sentence for her complicity. The damage he caused was immeasurable. He betrayed not just his country, but the trust of every agent who had risked their life to provide information, at least 10 of whom were executed because of his greed.
A stunning betrayal from the heart of the CIA. It's a story that shows how personal demons, debt, ego, and addiction can lead a man to betray everything he's supposed to stand for. Thank you for that incredible story, Ben. If you, our listeners, were as captivated by this tale of Cold War espionage as we were, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the secret world of intelligence, and share it with your friends. Your support is what allows us to keep these important stories alive.
Thank you all for listening.
That's our show for today. Join us next time on Case Files.